Good morning. Ooh, people have not had coffee yet. Good morning. That was better. How is everyone? Feeling good? All right. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about movements, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter and why Black Lives Matter is not just a movement for Black people. So movements happen when people come together with a shared purpose to create change. Movements are comprised of everyday people who are attempting to accomplish extraordinary things. Leaders, alliances and coalitions, and a shared political goal and a plan for the future is what encapsulates a movement. Movements use a combination of powerful strategies, including organizing, direct action, protest, advocacy, media, policy, legislation, research, and of course, academia. Movements, as you probably know, are important because they can change the world by getting laws passed and laws enforced, by advancing social, economic, and political change, and/or by changing culture and changing the way that people behave, relate to one another, and see or acknowledge each other. Now, I start off with a very basic definition of movements because it's important to understand Black Lives Matter in the context of a movement that we did not start. Sorry. Black Lives Matter began as a love note that I wrote on Facebook in 2013 after Trayvon Martin was murdered in his community. He was 17. And I wrote that love letter after his killer was acquitted in his murder. I declared in that love letter that Black Lives Matter in a response to the responses that I was seeing in my community on social media about how people had been impacted, not just by Trayvon's murder, but by the subsequent decision of a jury of his peers. You see, I was seeing all of these people saying, well, that was a tragedy. It shouldn't have happened. But that's why we need our kids to pull up their pants. That's why we need our kids not to wear hoodies. And it sounds ridiculous, but in fact, in places like Oklahoma, they tried to pass legislation banning the wearing of hoodies, supposedly as a way to prevent violence against Black people. I saw people saying things like, well, that's why our kids need to get a good education. That's why our kids need to vote. That's why we need to make more money. That's why. But what of those various that's whys explains away why a 17-year-old child was killed in their own community by an adult who decided that Trayvon did not belong there? What is voting going to do about that? Or pulling up your pants? Or having a PhD? You see, I know that those fallacies are exactly that, fallacies, because my uncle, who has many degrees and a powerful job, was stopped one day on Union Street in the middle of the day wearing a three-piece suit by a police officer because he fit the description. He actually spent a night in jail until we could bail him out, until we could convince these officers that he was not the description. So you see, voting and pulling up your pants and having a degree and having money doesn't actually protect you from racism. And see, the other things that I saw in that moment were things like, well, that was a tragedy, but he shouldn't have been walking at night. It was a tragedy, but where were his parents? It was a tragedy, but you saw those pictures of him on social media, right? I mean, he was a thug. You see, there's all of these coded ways in which we talk about Black people that criminalize us, that marginalize us, that exploit us, that disenfranchise us. And there had to be something done. And so in that moment, when a jury acquitted George Zimmerman of the senseless murder of a child, I wrote a love letter to people who look like me, reminding us that our lives actually do matter. That it doesn't matter if you have a GED, a PhD, or no degree, as Fannie Lou Hamer would say. We all deserve access to our fullest humanity. It doesn't matter if you wear your pants around your ankles or your pants around your waist. You still don't deserve to be shot in the street like a rabid dog. My sister Patrice put a hashtag in front of those 3 words, Black Lives Matter, of which I ended my love letter, so that people could follow that conversation on social media. My sister Opal created a series of social media platforms designed for people who were already having these conversations online, trying to make sense of what kind of country do we live in where we would allow a 17-year-old child to be slaughtered in their own community? And then what do we do about it, more importantly? She designed those platforms so that people who were chattering online and sharing and liking and retweeting could come together and connect to do something offline in real time, in real life, because that is actually how power is built. That is actually how change happens. Patrice and our brother Darnell, a year later, organized a freedom ride to Ferguson after Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and his body lay in the street for 4.5 hours. Over 500 people responded in less than 10 days from 15 cities around the country and from Canada. And we spent the weekend building with people in Ferguson, Missouri, who were traumatized. Because they had chosen to stand up, they were met with tanks and riot gear and tear gas and rubber bullets. And in fact, if you were watching CNN August 9th, 2014, you probably thought you were seeing images from Baghdad instead of a small suburb that nobody had ever heard of in St. Louis. So you see, the murder of Mike Brown, similar to the murder of Trayvon Martin, similar to the murder of Oscar Grant in 2009, just 3 blocks from my house. He was murdered New Year's Day on a BART platform by an officer who claimed he thought he was reaching for his taser and didn't realize he reached for his gun. And when he shot Oscar, Oscar's last words were, "I got a daughter." Similar to the murder of Renisha McBride, who, after getting into a car accident in the middle of the night, went onto the porch of a man named Ted Wafer to ask for help. "Please help me." And he opened the door and he looked at her and he went inside, got his shotgun, came back and shot her in the face through the door. So you see, we did not create this movement. This movement is a part of a long arc in the Black freedom movement, which quite frankly began in the early 1600s with the advent of chattel slavery. You know, when Black people were stolen from our homes, packed in the bottoms of boats and chained together and sold as property to labor for what is now called the United States of America. So when we ask, well, how did this movement begin? I always start there. Because anytime you deny human beings their right to be human, there will be a response, a resistance. It's in our blood. It's in our blood to live, to want to breathe, to want to have family and connection and relationships, to want to be able to walk with your head held high, feeling a sense of your purpose. That is something that is inside of all of us. And yet not all of us are afforded the dignity that we deserve. That's not a new idea. And so in a lot of ways, while we are the co-creators of a global network that now has 42 chapters around the world, we did not start this movement. We are proud participants in the long arc of history. Now, it's important when we talk about Black Lives Matter to not just talk about it as a hashtag. Hashtags don't start movements, people do. Hashtags are expressions of things that are already in existence. So don't think that you can go on social media right now and pick a hashtag and start a movement. It doesn't actually work that way. Sorry. There's the hashtag, which allows people to be a part of a conversation. There's the platforms on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, Tumblr, that allow people to share their visions, share information, share their analysis, their thoughts, their questions, their dismay, their anger. It's also a place for trolls, but we don't have to go there. There's a network of 42 chapters around the world, and then there is a movement that is comprised of many people, institutions, organizations, individuals who are like, I'm not a part of any organization, I'm just somebody who cares about the future of this planet. And those things are all related, but they're not all the same or interchangeable. Yeah, so you can't call the Black Lives Matter hashtag the movement. You can't call the network the movement. The movement is this whole thing. And then there are important components within it. I'd like to start there because I think it's important for us to be clear about what movements are and aren't, and not all movements are aimed towards the liberation of our society. We know that because there's an election in a couple days. And we laugh, but I was just thinking to myself, my God, in just a few days, we will have another leader of the free world. And yet, there are very different visions that each of those candidates are offering. What we see on the right is a populist movement. What we see on the left is a populist movement. And then what we see in between are movements that don't identify with either side. It's interesting. It's an interesting time to be alive. But I want to make sure that you understand that this movement, this particular movement, is not just a movement for Black people. And if that's how you understand Black Lives Matter, then you understand the way that race and racism works in this country. You see, it should mean something to each of you that there are people who are robbed of their fundamental humanity. Because as people, that could potentially happen to you as well. Just depends on what categories we create, which categories we want to afford power and privilege to, and which ones we don't. And in a lot of ways, while it's historical, it's also incredibly arbitrary. Meaning, you should not feel protected from the impacts of a system that robs people of their humanity. Black Lives Matter is not just about police violence. Police violence is just the tip of the iceberg of a huge glacier of a phenomenon that we call state-sanctioned violence, which is essentially violence that is sanctioned by our government and by the institutions that form the foundation of our society. For example, we incarcerate more people than anywhere else on the planet. 2.5 million people, as of today, are sitting in cages, but yet we consider ourselves the most democratic place in the world. 1 million of those people that are sitting behind bars are Black. 1 million. The large majority are there for nonviolent offenses. More than 70% are there for nonviolent offenses. The fastest growing population in our prisons and jails are Black women. Not because we are inherently criminal, but of course because, number one reason, defending yourself against intimate partner violence. Number two reason, poverty. Writing a check that doesn't have sufficient funds. Taking action to feed your family. And more people are in those positions today. How many of you have heard the statistic that women make 78 cents to every dollar that a man makes? How many of you have heard that? Cool, it's true for white women and white men. Black women make 64 cents to every 78 cents that white women make. When we talk about climate change and who is the most impacted, we should think about our family at Standing Rock, who's fighting to protect our water supply from an oil pipeline. You see, we're all complicit in this. We should think about, when we think about climate change, we should think about Black communities like those in New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, severely impacted by the impacts and the effects of corporate greed, of the hoarding of resources, of the misuse of resources. You see, it's people who are poor and Black, poor and indigenous, poor and of color, who are often living in areas that are the worst hit, and yet they have the least amount of access to resources to be resilient from the greed that plagues this country. See, Black Lives Matter is not just about Black people. It's about all of us. I'm going to close with this. There's, of course, so much more to say. We could go on and on, right? I wish we could go on for another hour, because there's some stuff we got to talk about. But I'll close with this. You know, there's this thing that people do, and they call it All Lives Matter. It's very strange. It's very strange. It's actually bizarre. I mean, of course all lives matter. Somebody tweet that. Tweet. Black Lives Matter co-founder says all lives matter. So that we understand that we know that all lives matter. This is not a competition between people. It's not Black supremacy, as I've heard before. We're not trying to turn the triangle and oppress white people. That's not actually what we're here to do. But All Lives Matter is shorthand for White Lives Matter. And so we should just be honest about that. When you deploy All Lives Matter in response to the grief and the rage and the pain that Black people are experiencing when we are gunned down in the street, when we are locked in cages, when we are denied the things that we need to survive, much less live a full life, and you say, All Lives Matter, that actually means White Lives Matter. We should just be honest. Because it's a way to insert into the conversation a doubt that people are suffering. It is a way to insert into the conversation, well, I mean, whatever. That's essentially what that sounds like. Of course, all lives matter. Black people, indigenous people have been saying that for a really long time. Consider that. But we don't live in a world where all lives matter. When I turn on the television and I hear things like, we're gonna build a wall around this country, when I hear things like, we need to protect law and order, when I hear things like, we're gonna lock them up, all lives don't matter. So if we want to get to a world where all lives matter, first thing we have to do is acknowledge that we don't live in that world right now. We have to break the cycle of amnesia that this country is built on. We don't live in a world where all lives matter, but we can if we put our minds, our hearts, our action, and our energy towards it. So yes, all lives matter. And for all lives to matter, Black lives must matter too. Because you see, none of us get free without all of us being free. So you gotta ask yourself, are you ready to build this movement? 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 Well, if you're ready, let's get to work. Thank you. Woo.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And for everything that you have done, we tremendously appreciate it. What is the role for white people in the Black Lives Matter movement?
Thank you. Let me take two more.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of yours. I guess my question is just about the role of young people in this movement. I know I just graduated from college and I'm feeling pulled. There's so much going on. How do we focus our energy and how do we join in with the greater movements that are already happening?
Yeah, thanks. One more, and then I'll answer all three.
Hi, thank
Hey.
you. Alex Bawa, St. Petersburg College. The correlation of the disenfranchisement of minorities is undisputable. What do you think is the causation of this correlation, and what do you think we can do to improve equal opportunity for all?
Great questions. Okay, what is the role of white people in this movement? Ooh, we could do a whole other keynote on that. But I'm gonna do some quick things. So one, we just talked about how connected we are, right? Okay, so the other thing I didn't say is I do think that when people say all lives matter, it's really actually a question of where do I fit, okay? And where you fit, right, is to help chip away at this thing that we've been trying to chip away at for centuries. Yeah, so a couple things that you can do. Vote. And like really vote. So I'm not a fan of either party, and this is probably like a nonpartisan thing, so really, like, I'm really not a fan. But there is stuff at stake, and I want to be honest. I think it's really strange for people to sit out. If you watch television, I don't see how you could sit out. I really don't. I really don't. So for those of us who mobilized around a different vision, that vision is still here, but also now there's a choice between 4, but really 2. So make a choice, because it's gonna matter. It's gonna matter to me, it's gonna matter to you, it's gonna matter to poor white people in Pittsburgh, it's gonna matter to poor white folks in Appalachia. Like, all this stuff actually does matter. You don't have to like people, they don't need to be your friend, they don't need to be your buddy who you go out to dinner with. They're actually making policies and decisions on your behalf. So that's one thing you can do. They're also deciding, and not just at the presidential level, but all the way through, how money gets distributed, which impacts our communities, right? It impacts how we feed the criminal justice system or how we starve it. It impacts whether or not we deal with the impacts of climate change. It impacts who we put in courtrooms to decide whether people go to cages or whether they go home to their families and get to take advantage of rehabilitation programs. So voting is like a huge thing. Second thing that you can do is talk to other white people about racism. It's totally uncomfortable. People are like, I don't want to talk about it, but like, do it. Do it. You're gonna mess up, you're gonna make mistakes, somebody's gonna be mad at you, so what? Do it anyway. Because as long as we don't acknowledge this huge pink elephant in front of us, we have no chance of getting away from it. No chance whatsoever. And just quick note on that, it's not about like people in white hoods. Like, you just need to know that. It's not about people in white hoods. It's about systems, structures, policies, procedures that disenfranchise people from the things they need. And lots of folks are complicit in that, including you. If you don't want to be complicit in it, take a stand and fight back against it. So those are 2 big things that white folks can do, and a role for white folks in this movement. Second question, what is the role of young people? Man, young people are like already in motion. People are like, oh, they're the future. No, they're the now. And, you know, I think that, I know when I was in college and I was trying to figure out what I was gonna do, my mom was like, you should make a lot of money. And I was like, I wanna help people. And she was like, you should make a lot of money so you can help people. But I do think that it's important, as you're thinking about which path am I headed on, to be thinking about how you can do the most good for the world. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's got to be a part of a nonprofit organization. Doesn't mean everybody's got to like martyr themselves for the cause. But what it does mean is that you use your brilliance, your skills, your talents, and your resources to make life better for people, not just for yourself. Yeah, so that's the role for young people. And then, where does all this stuff come from? Capitalism. And before you call me a raving socialist, which many of you will, it's just a fact. When you have an economic system that profits off of people, that prioritizes profit over people and the well-being of the planet, it means that you are going to have people that have and people that don't. There's going to be ways in which we segregate people to get consent for that degree of like exploitation and marginalization. So we need a different way of being in relationship with each other. Yeah.
Hello, Alicia. Thank you
Hi.
so much again for this. I have a question about, so I'm in public affairs school, and for those of us who know that public affairs is very corrupt and there's a lot of work to be done, what suggestions do you have for people that are going into public sector of how to really make a change to that systemic racism that goes in criminal justice and all those different sectors within the public sphere?
Okay, cool, one more.
Hi, my name is Angelica Brown. I don't have a question per se, I have a comment. I just really want to thank you for being here. I'm from the city where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Memphis, Tennessee. And when I think of you, I think of what he said. You can kill the dreamer, but you cannot kill the dream.
Ashe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sis.
So you had mentioned that women make a different amount than men, and you also mentioned that black women make a different amount than white women. I was wondering if you meant wages or earnings, and if you could explain what those mean to you.
It's both. It's both. So in terms of earnings, I think about earnings including things like assets, right? And black women are like at the bottom. Wages is like what you actually get paid, yeah? Totally at the bottom. So it's both. It's both. There's no place where black women are exceeding in the economy. Like no place. So like we have Oprah. That's pretty much it. Yeah. Public sector stuff, whew, rough stuff. That's a really long conversation. But I think the first place to start is how do we put the public back in public? Right, so, you know, I mean, there's lots of things in here, but quite frankly, part of the problem, there's two sides of it. One is there is a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability, but there's also a lack of participation as a direct result of the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability. And so that leads to a crisis of imagination, what some would call a lack of a revolutionary vision. And if we lack that vision, we have no hope of changing things. Yeah? So, increase transparency, increase accountability, increase participation by increasing faith in the potential of change. Yeah, I think that's all the time I got. Thank you.